The panel will be moderated by Badria Al-Sabah, who is a Smith graduate for 2017. She was head of the Student Government Association last year, and she is currently a UN intern, and she is also sitting on the Board of Trustees. So we're very happy to have Badria back at Smith, and she will introduce the panelists of students.
All right, welcome everyone. I'm super excited to be here and also really excited that this conference could incorporate some student perspectives, which I think are super relevant at the moment. So I'm just going to start by introducing all of these lovely speakers, and then we'll go from there. They'll speak for approximately 10 minutes each, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and answers. Don't be shy. So starting with our first speaker to my right, this is Selma. Selma is a senior majoring in biology and minoring in chemistry and hails from the great state of Florida. She really likes Florida. She is passionate about using social justice as a tool to bring together different faiths, and this year is leading the Interfaith Alliance, serving as a community health organizer on our campus. To add an interesting fact, Selma can also eat 9 chicken wings in under 1 minute.
I think it's 7, but it's okay.
So it's up for debate. So next to my right, we have Sudi. Sudi is a senior, so class of 2018 here at Smith, studying government with an international relations focus. She hopes to get a master's in social work and pursue a career in child advocacy and the advancement of children's rights. So next we have Inas. Inas is a senior here at Smith College, studying religion and Middle East studies. As both an artist and a student, she has focused her work on social change and Islam, specifically thinking about gender, sexuality, and reimagining religiosity. So our next speaker will be Zoya. Zoya is a sophomore here at Smith. She's an economics and English double major with interests in development, economics, literary journalism, and theater. And finally, we have Yasin. Yasin is the first-year class president and participates in different clubs and committees on campus. She has a history of organizing and is passionate about having difficult conversations needed to bridge people across difference. So with that, we will proceed, starting with Selma.
Oh, sure, I didn't ask first. Hey guys. So a lot of us on this panel today, could you guys hear me? Or should I get closer?
Good.
I'm good? Okay. So a lot of us here today, we identify as Muslim Americans or American Muslims or whatever it is. It's a hyphenated identity that is incredibly complex. It finds itself at the intersections of multiple identities, and it carries great weight in today's society, not simply because of like post-Trump's world, but for decades, especially for Muslims who are really visible, both men and women. So a lot of us remember exactly where we were on 9/11. Do you guys remember where you guys were on 9/11? Okay, so some of us are a little young, like Yasin was a baby. And a lot of you guys are kind of old, like no offense. But I remember where I was. I was 5.5 years old, and I was sitting in Miss Kirkham's kindergarten class in Cooper City Elementary, almost, I think, 17 years ago. And I remember at the end of it, like all the parents had picked up their kids, because it's like a terrorist attack. At the end of the day, there was only like 2 kids left. Either like our parents didn't really love us that much, or B, they actually realized the greatest fear came the days after 9/11. In some ways, 9/11 marked the beginning of a new existence. In some ways, not really. Maybe we just became aware of the tactics law enforcement were implementing against other radical minorities for decades. 9/11, it was met by widespread, rampage, unjustified surveillance, discrimination, censorship, and marginalization of Muslim communities across this nation. So the FBI began participating, and a lot of you guys are familiar with counterintelligence program tactics, which is like nothing new. It's been used for decades, actually, to wrongfully imprison and harass members of, like, for example, like the Black Panthers Party, members of the Civil Rights Movement, and even like activists and like anti-Vietnam War activists. But this time, it was used against Muslim Americans. Initially, it was used for Black Muslims, and then the focus shifted to South Asian and Arab Muslims who were practicing in their communities. And the law enforcement began to map out where the Muslim communities across the country. They started which these maps still exist and it's still going on to this day. But they extensively mapped out, in particular, they targeted like New York City, Orange County, Broward County, because Broward is where 9/11 hijackers were actually trained. They mapped out where they lived, where they went to the mosque, where their businesses were, where they went to school. And they conducted warrantless surveillance of Muslims, both physically and online, like for example, like blogs and social media. And they wiretapped their phones. I actually remember the wiretap part pretty well. You could actually hear, like, if the tapes broke by any chance. And I remember, like, my phone was wiretapped, and if occasionally the tape will break, and you'll be like, oh shoot, my phone was wiretapped this whole time. But the worst part was they infiltrated our communities. They got common people to like spy on each other and told them to be like the eyes and the ears of each other. And this was like this whole part of this greater war on terror, the so-called war on terror that U.S. was participating because they couldn't find these so-called homegrown terrorists. So they decided to create them illegitimately and terrorize the lives of hundreds and thousands of Muslim Americans. And I still remember the days of warrantless surveillance in my own community and the intimidation and the censorship that came with it. I was fairly young, but I mean, I'm pretty young now still, but like I was like a kid back then. And I remember like I came back from Sunday school and there was all this like hush and wush, like all this gossip. And I wasn't really cool even in Sunday school, which is kind of easy place to be cool at. And like later I learned like coming home that their parents were reached out to be informants. And for a few weeks following that, I went to Sunday Madrasa and I was getting my samosa for lunch, and there was a black Cadillac came and it parked itself right in front of our playground. It parked itself at noon and it came every noon for the next 6 years. A few weeks after that, so I had a dope-ass ustad. I don't know if you guys know what ustad is, but it basically means teacher, like a religious teacher. And he was really cool. He wasn't like, I remember like last session we had like that ustad who beat the ruler or whatever someone talked about. Yeah, no, he was like really cool. He played the guitar and stuff, and he would tell us like we can rap our Arabic letters so we finished our surah. So I remember he was gone 1 week, and he disappeared, and we later learned that he was being questioned by the FBI. And he came back almost 3 to 4 weeks later, and he came back clean shaven, and he shaved off his beard, and he instilled an American flag in our classroom in our madrasa. In the weeks following that, my ustad's appearance and his revival or whatever, young men and boys, my older brother's friends, they were being questioned, detained, and deemed as suspicious by our greater community. And finally, that year, 3 boys in my own community were successfully entrapped by the FBI. Boys who were my brother's Tarawih buddies, and sentenced to 14 years in prison for not committing any particular crime, but for allegedly committing a thought crime. Those days of unconstitutional surveillance and entrapment aren't exactly just days in the past. Right before the election, hundreds of American Muslims were actually reached out by the FBI, my own friends and family members, and they were asked if they knew about the airstrike that I believe killed Al-Qaeda leader Farouk al-Qahtani. They're not even from Afghanistan or from those areas. These surveillance, these infringement of basic civil liberties, censorship is a unique experience in the lives of Muslim Americans. It's an experience that my relatives abroad never really had to face. Blacks, Muslims, Latinx communities and radical minorities have been experiencing this for decades in this country. So I recently had an international student in the 5 College, someone who's actually from my own motherland, who asked me on the PIFTA bus, and she said, "Why are you guys always so pissed?" And she meant like Muslim Americans, like why do we always get the microaggressive and we hold professors accountable for the action? And that's why, because we have to fight. We grew up having to fight to exist. We grew up with the system trying to uproot our own identities and our communities. We grew up faced with censorship or resistance in our tongues. So that's why we don't take shit from no one, including this $1 billion worth of an institution.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. Assalamu alaikum. I titled this, I got 99 identity crises, but being Muslim ain't one. And this is why. Being born in Somalia and growing up in the United States, I have become a confused human being. I know no one can take away my Somali identity, but I feel my mother tongue being slowly dominated by English. I'm too Somali to be deemed American and too American to be deemed Somali. But amidst all that chaos, there is one constant identity that cannot be shaken, and that's my Muslim identity. During my transition into the American society from Somalia, I had to negotiate between my Somali identity and my American identity. While at school, I stuck with other Somalis and spoke Somali whenever I had the chance. But while at home, peanut butter and J sandwiches and cereal quickly became my comfort foods instead of Somali food. And while my Somali identity and my American identity were getting intertwined, my Muslim identity was constantly in everything I did, as if it were a third wheel to my identity relationships. Islam was and is always there. I wore the hijab ever since I was in preschool. I learned to read and write Quran just as I was learning to read and write English. It was a thing I held on to as I underwent a major surgery. As I slowly drifted off under the anesthesia, I was reading the Ayatul Kursi, which is a verse from the Quran. My Muslim identity is the identity that grew along with me, and it's the identity that's a huge part of who I am today. My Muslim identity is a conscious identity as well as a subconscious identity. I consciously put on the headscarf. I consciously pray the 5 daily prayers. I consciously try to better myself for the sake of God and myself. But my Muslim identity has become one with my subconscious actions. For example, on the bus back to Smith from winter break, I saw a Muslim friend of mine get on the same bus. Without me even considering my surroundings, I burst out, "Assalamu alaikum." And I do this all the time. Take, for instance, I'm at the grocery store talking to my mom on the phone, asking her what we might need. And throughout the conversations, as I walk down the aisles, I'm constantly saying, "Inshallah, inshallah," and end the call, "Assalamu alaikum," while I'm in the line to buy my groceries. And yes, I'm that person who always says "mashallah" in conversations. It's like the words come out of my mouth before my brain registers what I had just said. But why should I censor what I say? Others who are in more powerful and more public platforms don't. I have become very conscious of the hate Islam has received and has been receiving and has received in the past. Really, the identity that I have identified with most out of all my other identities is being targeted. What a surprise. Being Somali wasn't enough. Being a woman wasn't enough. Now they've come for my Muslim identity. Well, so be it, because that identity is too far rooted within me for anyone to weed out. I don't know who else I would be without my multitude of identities. But most importantly, who would I be without my Muslim identity? I'll tell you, I wouldn't be here, speaking as a proud Muslim Somali American woman, now would I? My ethnic identity is visible. My gender identity is visible. My national identity is orally visible. Why shouldn't my religious identity? The only identity I can control and the one I want to be visible. So what I do is I bring all my other identities to reconcile with the thought that my Muslim identity is not going anywhere and it's going to be as visible as they are. I may have identity crises, but my Muslim identity ain't no dilemma. Thank you and Jazakallah khair for listening.
All right, Nas, take it away.
Okay, can you all hear me? So I'm going to be talking about my research today. As Badriya mentioned, I'm a religion major with a focus on gender and sexuality. Last semester I took a class with Professor Suleiman Murad on Sharia law, and I did my paper on homosexuality in Islam. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge the history of this work. There has been a lot of work done on homosexuality in Islam. I think a lot of times we think that homosexuality and Islam are these two separate and maybe contradictory things. And I would argue that they're not separate. It's not surprising or new to be asking questions about homosexuality in Islam. And actually that Muslim scholars have been addressing these issues for a very long time, even if they didn't use the term homosexuality. So even like since pre-modern Islamic thought, these issues have been addressed. So anything I say today, basically, it has already been said before. So briefly, some of what I have read, I'll just get into that a little bit. So I read Khalid al-Wahib's work on, like he talks about before, homosexuality in the Arab Islamic world. And he begins by thinking about whether Islam is tolerant or intolerant to homosexuality. And he argues that we should reevaluate this question and really think about what we mean when we talk about homosexuality and when we talk about Islam. So this question, what do we mean by homosexuality? The term, as we use it today, he argues, is it reflects a modern conception of identity that didn't used to exist in the past. And so when we talk about homosexuality, we're using it basically as an umbrella term, which in the Arab Islamic world from 1500 to 1800 may have been seen as several different things. So for example, specific sexual acts were seen as different than same-sex love. I think we also should examine what we mean when we talk about Islam, because there are many different Islams, which I'm sure everyone here can tell based on this conference. So it really depends on the time, the place, the sect, the school of thought, and even depending on the scholar. So I think a lot of my work is trying to move beyond this acceptance or rejection of homosexuality in Islam. So a lot of people have done this work of examining the text and the tradition and thinking about reform in Islamic law and pushing for that reform. So one example is Scott Kugel, who wrote a book called Homosexuality in Islam. So people will generally, when they talk about homosexuality and they say like, oh, homosexuality is a sin, they usually cite Quranic verses which talk about the story of Lot. They usually cite Surat An-Nisa, which addresses al-fahisha, and they usually cite hadith, which condemn homosexuality. So Scott Kugel, in his work, he uses a couple of different methods to think about homosexuality. He uses tools of Islamic law. He also looks at the Quran. He argues that the story of Lot is not about homosexuality, but is rather about rape and inhospitality. And he argues that in Surat An-Nisa, which talks about al-fahisha, some people have said that this is about homosexuality, and he argues that it's about immorality more generally. And he also sees hadith, which condemn homosexuality, as inauthentic based on their chain of narration. Basically, any assertion that can be made about homosexuality, whether it's accepted or rejected, has been made before. So I'm less interested in what Islam has to say, or I guess more appropriately, what people have read into the tradition, and more interested in Muslim communities. So I guess I would preface talking about Muslim communities by saying that having conversations about queer issues in Muslim communities is very difficult, especially with regard to Islamophobia. To talk about homophobia in Muslim communities is to further demonize your own communities as backwards, traditional, or oppressive. And conversations about gay rights in these contexts are often co-opted by the West as justification for militaristic and interventionist policies in Muslim-majority countries, and is also used as justification for discriminatory policies, especially in regards to immigration in Europe. I'm specifically thinking of the Netherlands, and citizenship tests which are used to exclude Muslims from immigrating to those countries. So for people who are gay and Muslim, I think this leads to a kind of double oppression. These people not only face homophobia in Muslim communities, but also Islamophobia in queer communities, and in many ways they're silenced about both of these oppressions. So for a lot of people, these two identities can be in tension, which is not to say that it is for everyone. For a lot of people, there's no problem in reconciling these identities. I think the point really is that there's no one answer or voice in Islam. So while Islam can be empowering for some, and this conference is about empowering women in Islam, I think it's also really important to recognize that Islam can be disempowering for others. And so both of these voices are really important. And especially in my experience living in the West and in the face of Islamophobia, I've seen my whole life a strong push to show Islam and its beauty and to talk about how Islam is progressive and liberal and empowering. And I think that's definitely pushing back towards this idea of Islam as backwards or traditional. But I think in a lot of ways, a rhetoric of Islam being only progressive, liberal, and empowering is just as damaging as showing Islam as backwards or oppressive, because it erases the nuance of people's experiences. So again, I want to move beyond this binary of whether like Islam promotes homosexuality or homophobia, or whether it's traditional or modern or empowering or disempowering. I think rather than looking for one answer, whether Islam is X or Y, I think we really need to like listen to people's voices and see that it can be both empowering and disempowering. And then finally, I think we also need to really think about the questions that we're asking and what the agendas are that are underlying our questions. So when we're thinking about this question of is Islam tolerant or intolerant to homosexuality, who is asking this question and why are they asking this question? And also, what are the real-life effects that asking questions like this have for people? And then finally, talking about empowerment, I think we need to examine what we mean when we talk about empowerment and what that looks like. And then not only what that looks like, but also who specifically we're thinking of. So if we're talking about empowering Muslim women, I don't think we can talk about empowering Muslim women without also talking about queer and trans women. So, thank you.
Alrighty. Can everyone hear me? All right. Assalamu alaikum.
Closer.
My name is Zoya. My name is Zoya. And when I was asked to be a part of this panel and I discovered that I was the only international student in the group, it felt natural to sort of take that perspective and reflect on how that has impacted my identity as a Muslim. And it hasn't been hard to find things to say because being a sophomore at Smith, my 2 years have been nothing if not extremely reflective. I was born a Muslim in a typically religious family in Pakistan. Growing up, I knew my parents really wanted me to embrace Islam, and so I did it, gladly. I loved the excitement of waking up in the middle of the night for suhoor, and I was addicted to offering prayer because it felt equivalent to throwing a penny in a wishing well. Maybe all my prayers would come true tomorrow, and maybe none of them would. Either way, I would get points from Allah for being a good kid and offering my prayers. Obviously, I was pretty type A about my religion. I was making my parents proud, and they seemed to think that Islam was pretty great, so it probably was. It was not a complicated phase in my life. When I came to high school, my practice of Islam became more of a social statement of the kind of family I came from, what my values were. It was also quite a passive way of practicing Islam. I continued to check all the boxes I had checked as a kid, but this time with much less self-driven passion. Now it was just something I was supposed to do, and I was convinced it was crucial to my identity, so I continued to go through the motions. I found comfort in the routine, and I wasn't too concerned with actively engaging with Islamic thought or the Quran's teachings, partly because I felt I didn't have time, and partly because sometimes I was scared of what I would find and have to alter my ways. It was around this time that I was first absolutely jarred by Islam and forced to question it. The summer before I was supposed to start at Smith, the Council of Islamic Ideology of Pakistan proposed an amendment to a women's protection bill, which made it permissible for husbands to lightly beat their wives. I was horrified, and all I could think of was all the men who had violent tendencies and took this piece of news as a sign that Islam allowed men to beat their wives. How many women would get lightly beaten that night before they went to bed? My mother couldn't understand it. I was in tears, and she just couldn't fathom why I was so affected. She said it didn't matter, and no one thought too hard about what the government was up to and whether this actually would be implemented and affect lives. But I felt like I had been lied to, and as if my religion was not mine anymore. It was then that I realized that not only was avoiding active engagement with Islamic thought lazy, but it left me with no way to use source material to prove any points I would want to make to disprove these people, to disprove such actions. I would have to try to better educate myself about my religion, figure out the truth, and fight people who are in authority and making such ridiculous statements on national television and in state assemblies. I also realized, more importantly, that I was living the definition of Islam that Pakistan had shaped for me. Through years of military dictatorships, through years of various extensive socio-political and historical factors. And so the next question was, how did Muslims elsewhere live? Muslims growing up in other countries who had been affected by history differently than I had been. I suspected they weren't identical to myself, and their countries' histories and cultures had affected their practice as well. I was curious to know what a secular country was like. And these were the thoughts I carried to the US with me. I was already on the lookout for cultural differences in the practice of Islam, and this made the experience at Smith very interesting, albeit overwhelming at times. I was apprehensive about practicing Islam outside the Pakistani context for the first time. I was scared things about Islam, which had always been important to me and true to me, they would fade away, because if my Islam was so rooted in Pakistan, would distance from Pakistan reduce my affinity for Islam? I wanted to stay true to Pakistan, but also give some real thought to the way I practice my religion and not just do things because that's how they've always been done and the way I've always seen them, but rather learn from Muslims coming from different countries around me and how they practice and how they justify their actions to themselves. And the experience is ongoing. I've come to realize what I find to be most important in Islam, how my practice changes once my parents aren't there to prod me, how to recognize when certain teachings can be done without, because there is more Pakistan in them than there is Islam. I take greater pride in being a Muslim now that I'm over here, but I'm also reminded that there is some real nasty sentiment towards us in the US, especially in the wake of the recent election. Most of all, I think coming here and thinking harder about Islam has made me very confident. I feel empowered when I make religious decisions because every day I realize my practice of Islam is less and less influenced by my culture, by my parents, or by America even, and it's more and more influenced by my informed opinion, and I'm quite proud of that.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahman. I'm sorry I didn't give you guys time to respond. We're going to do this again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. No one has ever asked me how my religion influences my activism. Let's just think about that for a second. I'm Muslim, I'm sitting here on a panel, and I participate in a lot of activist activities, but no one has ever asked me how my religion influences my activism. And I start off by saying that because in a day and age where people raise the black fist as a symbol of consciousness, of a vow to and symbol of fighting the good fight, people have been trying to create an image of what America should look like through any means possible. This means that an image isn't really about inclusiveness if there isn't your local hijabi perched in the corner. We're so used to seeing hijabis and posters for inclusivity that we don't question what it means to be a hijabi, what it means to be Muslim in a global movement for change. To wear hijab should not solely be a marker of faith, but should also make us think about the role of religion in youth activism. How much do we actually care about how my faith plays into what I have to say? We live in an age where information is so abundant, but we do not use it to inform ourselves. We are too complacent in our ignorance, and I really want us to question, how active is our activism? And how much do we really want to see change? The biggest influence on the way I go about activism has always been Islam. Being socialized as a Muslim, I grew up learning about how we should always help those in need. And when it comes to injustice, Allah says in Surah An-Insan, "O you who believe, be persistently standing firm in justice, as witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves or parents or relatives." And that will be asked on the day of judgment, what did we do when we saw injustice? I'm not an activist only because of the oppressions of Muslims in the world, but because justice is embedded in my religion and into my culture. Islam is a religion about personal growth and responsibility. We all have our own journeys and our own jihads, but Islam is also about how we treat our neighbors and what we do when we see our brothers and sisters struggling. It acknowledges that we can't have one ummah if we don't care about one another. Through Islam, I learned the idea that I'm my brother's keeper, that I can't be free until my Somalian brothers and sisters are free, until my Yemeni brothers and sisters are free, until my brothers and sisters in Burma are free as well. I wanted to talk about an idea that has really been on my mind this past semester. Because on November 15th, a video of Libyans being auctioned off as slaves for $400 was circulating a multitude of social networks. Following, images were released showing how extreme the slave trade is, as many people were facing severe human rights abuses. Many were deeply disturbed as how slavery could exist in 2017. On December 19th, there was a 16-year-old Palestinian girl named Ahed Tamimi, who was arrested after videos of her slapping 2 Israeli soldiers went viral. We hear about such shocking events, such shocking news of blatant oppression, but we don't understand the political discourse that has shaped post-colonialized Africa. We hear about Tamimi, but do we actually understand the decades of apartheid and occupation in Palestine? When these events happened, a lot of people were talking about how much they wish Smith had more spaces for dialogue about events happening on the local and global scale. I agree, and I feel like being in college will make or break your activism because you have the option to inform yourself and stay in touch with the world outside of Smith, or you can be consumed by the bubble we hear about all the time. Everyone quotes Maya Angelou that no one of us can be free until everyone's free. But how do we internalize it? When people think about being activists, it's confined solely to being a person who posts issues on the internet. But when will we acknowledge that it's not enough? We ironically overlook the first step to mobilizing and creating a sustained movement. That before the Black Panther Party was ever about anti-poverty programs or Black is Beautiful, Malcolm X, Huey Newton, Angela Davis were young intellectuals perched over books on Marx and Socrates. That before Chicano movements could be about challenging what it means to be Mexican American and mobilizing for agricultural rights, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta had to read in on Mexican American history and workers' rights. That before that unidentified man in Tiananmen Square, before the unidentified man could stand on a Chinese tank in a Tiananmen Square, and students could lead protests for change, students and workers had to read in on communism and the history of former Chinese leadership. Before we can think about revolutions and changing the world, we need to lay the proper foundations for informing ourselves. We cannot afford to underestimate the power of reading and talking to one another. It's impossible to come up with solutions to any issues if we do not make sure we understand the history and cultural context of the people that come before it. It is only when we have a knowledgeable context with cultural competency can we begin to grapple what means are most effective to solve it. So I'm proposing a youth activism coalition, one dedicated to literacy and bridging the gaps we need to be global citizens. Thank you.
I believe we are slightly ahead of schedule, if I'm correct. by about 15 minutes. So that means we have extra time for discussion and questions. So I'm also going to save my questions for the end. But yeah, so we'll open the floor up right now if anyone has any questions. Please. Yes.
Okay, I have a question for Yassine.
Yeah.
When you use that expression, helping those in need, I'm wondering if that isn't the exact opposite of empowering people, because it upholds and confirms existing power structures, and we are the givers to those who are in need. If this is really the categories we should be thinking about when we are thinking about genuine empowerment.
Good question. I think that helping those in need doesn't always have to be about money or about like the white savior complex where you go into a community and like your typical like avatar that comes and saves people. I think helping those in need can be simply asking people what they want and being responsive to what their needs are. It also can just be just standing, like underscoring what they, any activist movements that they're behind, whether that be funding the movements that they're in or understanding and getting the message that they want out there. Because a lot of the times, there are a lot of marginalized groups who are doing a lot on the forefront and a lot of people don't see it because their voices are not heard at all just because of who's in power and who controls the media and stuff like that. So there's like multiple ways that helping those in needs can be interpreted. It doesn't only have to be monetary based, but there are other things that we can do that people in power especially can do to like rise up people who don't have as much or who just want to get their voices out there.
Just take this whole table and then we'll move on from there. Just go from right to
My
left.
question is for Zoya. I was wondering about, you mentioned the ways in which being from Pakistan affected your identity as a Muslim in Pakistan's history, and then coming to the United States. But I was wondering if you thought that the United States had an effect on your identity as a Muslim when you were in Pakistan too. Like, was there any, because of the relationship, between the countries?
It's actually a very important question. A lot of Pakistani culture is drawn from American culture because we watch American movies, we grew up with the English, and we grew up with British English, but the media that we consume was largely American. So the American context was not at all unfamiliar to me before I came to the US. And I think the most important way that it affected me when I was in Pakistan was that we would see conceptions of American culture on TV and then be told that this is not us and this is not how we work, but it's fun to watch it anyway. So a very I consider it an infantile example now, but back home when any movie is played, my dad would make us close our eyes when the actors would kiss. Sex scenes were like censored, forwarded through, all of that stuff. So, and that's very common in American movies. There is a kiss scene at the end, at the start, all of that stuff. So it was romantic movies, whole thing. So it was very strange to see all of this, to hear music that does not at all relate to where I come from, to enjoy it, but also at the same time to be hyper aware of the fact that this is not us, this is not where we come from, but let's appreciate it anyway for what it is. And I think initially it caused me to be very skeptical of what really are we doing then? Like, why isn't there more representation for what our art is, for what our culture is? Why don't we hold that up and represent ourselves the way we want to be represented and consume that culture? And I think partly it's because the society has not moved fast enough in order to support the population's demand for media. So at the end of the day, we're just forced to sort of consume what's out there, and a lot of that is American media because it's rampant, it's everywhere. You can't not see it. And a lot of it was my parents' teachings, and you have to take both of them together. Like, you have to acknowledge that all of this exists, and you have to take it with a grain of salt because it's not where you come from, but learn to appreciate it while also remembering where you come from. And it was a personal struggle, it was a societal struggle, but I feel like you grow up with it. It's so ingrained that you don't really think about it. You acknowledge it, but it's just how it is. And there's no concrete way to pin down how it impacted, but it's always been a present thing in my culture. And I think that sort of solidifies when you make that distinction of where I come from and where they come from. So in my head, that solidified it, that I know where I'm from, but also I'm going to learn how to keep both of these things moving together, be able to appreciate certain things, but know where I draw the line. So, yeah.
So I have two questions. First is for Ines. So Ines was my former student. Louder? Okay. I'm going to speak louder.
Yes.
Okay. So it's been really nice to see the evolution of your thinking on this issue and also your mastery of this topic. And my question is basically, a lot of these conversations on homosexuality are about men, and the books written are by men. And I'm wondering if this kind of relative silence, there is work done on lesbianism, but there's a kind of relative silence, is something that reflects sexism, or is perhaps maybe a welcome silence because it allows for some form of protection. I don't think is the right word, but just it's not the target of this sort of whatever hateful campaigns, distorted campaigns of homophobia that exists, right? And my second question is for Sama. So you mentioned that I think it's really interesting always to hear about international students' perspectives of U.S. Muslims, how U.S. Muslims are perpetually pissed off. And I was surprised to hear that because I come away from every conversation with you kind of uplifted, and I see you as a happy and strong person. So
No, they're all alive.
You've also been very in close proximity to some really traumatizing things and people in your community as well. So I was wondering, where do you get this strength and happiness from, especially right now?
Okay. Yeah, so I'm really not a happy person, but it means a lot that you think that of me. I would say, again, it goes back to my faith. I mean, Islam originates from the harshest places during the harshest times. And if I can't find happiness during a harsh time, then am I really practicing the faith that I was born into and that I've chosen to practice? Yeah, and also I think being surrounded by incredibly strong Muslim Americans, like right now, is also like a reason why I find this strength. I wouldn't say like I have been personally as traumatized as members of my other members of my own community. For example, like my brothers were not directly interrogated, but their friends were. My moms were, my teachers were. So I think seeing that and putting in perspective and using this kind of energy to put that energy in my own social activism has helped me create this fake smile of mine.
Ines, do you mind if I just add something? And just adding to Mohammed's comment, I think that's like a really, really great question to ask, because even beyond scholarship, the distinction between male homosexuality and female homosexuality extends constitutionally. Like it's embedded in many of the constitutions of countries around the Arab world and Muslim countries. So it's really interesting. You could just,
Okay, so it's definitely something that I've come across in my own research. When I was doing my paper on homosexuality in Islam, most of the work that I found addressed liwat, sodomy, and much less so addressing, in terms of like specific sexual acts, much less so addressing female-female sexual acts. And so that was definitely a challenge I faced, and pretty much none of the literature that I read was by none of it was by female jurists. So some of what I read in my research did address Sehak tribadism, but I think it was only like 2 or 3 works, and so pretty much the focus was always on male-male sexual acts and on sodomy, and even like in terms of media and visual culture, One documentary I watched there's this documentary called How Gay is Pakistan? And the focus was on this British Pakistani man who is gay. He goes back to Pakistan, and he tries to see what the gay community is like in Pakistan, if there's a gay scene. And there was not one cisgender woman who was talking about lesbianism, and it was, most of it was focused on male homosexuality in Pakistan. So I definitely think that that is something that has come up a lot, like for people who are doing that work. There is one scholar, Samar Habib, who I was looking at, who has focused more on lesbianism. But definitely it has been, when homosexuality was addressed, in pre-modern Islamic thought, what I was looking at, the concept of zina, which is like unlawful sexual intercourse, that was the thing that was most addressed, which is like sex between a man and a woman outside of marriage. And that's actually why a lot of times, like the reason that sodomy was punished was based on analogical reasoning, because people likened it to zina. And so conversations about female homosexuality were like pretty much non-existent. And I think in some ways that is a protection, but I think it is also a manifestation of I think it's both. When punishment, some of my work was on like actual punishments in Islamic law, and so punishments for sodomy were, like sometimes sodomy was, it's very complicated because a lot of times people who said that sodomy is not considered the same as zina, they would apply the concept of ta'zir, which is that like it should be punished by the discretion of a judge. And so sometimes men were just let go. It was like, oh, you know, the judge will basically hide their sins, which is a concept called satr. So in that way, there was, I think, a protection for men that didn't necessarily exist for women, because you could apply this concept of ta'zir. But at the same time, I think female sexual acts in some ways were protected in the sense that it wasn't considered to be actual intercourse, because a lot of jurists didn't see female sexual acts as involving any real penetration. And so they weren't punished the same way that zina was, and zina is punished as a had crime, which means basically that there's like a set punishment for it. So in that way, I think there is a protection, but I think it's also an invalidation of that relationship. And so I think it's both. And I don't know whether it's a manifestation necessarily of sexism. Maybe it's just like I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about this like concept of homonormativity and what is common when we talk about, or like in queer spaces, what is the discourse that happens. And that's definitely something I've noticed. I don't know exactly where that comes from, but I think again it's both. In some ways a protection, but also in some ways I think an invalidation, and there's definitely a lack of representation. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, let's just finish with this table.
First, I just want to thank all of you for an incredibly erudite presentation. I don't think I was anywhere close to being this sort of formal and articulate when I was your age. So you are very young, in fact. You make me feel very old. I have two questions. One is for Yasin and one is for Salma. And I'll start with Salma, which I really enjoyed your presentation. One of the things that struck me was just you're tracking a kind of generational shift, right? And you're part of a generation that has lived now, that is living under a police state and under a surveillance state in a way that perhaps your parents and their grandparents were or at least didn't understand themselves to be. And there's a kind of heavy surveillance. And I was wondering if you see a kind of generational shift, right? You're talking about your own experiences, but I was wondering if you could make bigger claims about a kind of generation. And then whether that enables certain sorts of alliances with other minoritized populations that have also been living under a kind of police state for a long time, or not necessarily a long time, but a kind of shared experience, right? That actually is productive in the sense that it allows the possibility of sort of alliances across so-called communal difference. And then the other question was for Yasin. I was really struck by, again, a really just beautiful presentation. Something that you said at the end about the importance of reading for revolution. And the academic in me yes, thank God someone's talking about reading and history. And the activist in me was like, wait, no, why the emphasis on literacy? And I wanted to know whether you would be open to the experiences of non-literate populations who are also mobilizing political critique in different sorts of ways, and also open to the possibility of knowledge that doesn't necessarily take, literate form, right? So performance, poetry, kind of oral forms of knowledge that might also open up spaces for, again, political lives.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you so much. Of course, I definitely have noticed like a generational difference, even like in political attitudes and racial attitudes of my parents' generation, and like coming from a diasporic home. I think there's a large distrust of now like Muslim Americans with law enforcement that my parents didn't have. For example, like when I go through security check, I actually like give such a hard time with TSA. Like that day I was like, it's against my civil liberties to go through this machine, and it was like a huge line, and they had to pat me down, and like everyone, like I missed my first flight, I had to be put on the second flight. And my mom was like, this is so ridiculous, Salma, you don't have anything, why don't you just follow the rules? But I think being part of the second generation, living under shadow militarization, like always being policed and always being surveilled, has caused us to distrust politicians and law enforcement. And to your second part of the question, yeah, absolutely. I don't think in our parents' generation or generations before, we had such a strong alliance with particularly the Latinx community, with the LGBTQ community, with the Black community. And we also, I think, are finally recognizing the racism in our own communities, and particularly the South Asian and Arab community. How many Black Muslims are actually serving on the mosque boards? How much do we actually give them space to speak and let them actually hear their points of views and give them leadership and positions of power? So I think that is a result of our alliance with, like, for example, the BLM movement has made, like, Linda Sarsour, for example, a Muslim civil rights activist, has created a large alliance with the BLM movement of New York. But yeah, absolutely, I would say there's been a large generational difference, and hopefully we improve, for example, like our racist rhetoric in our communities.
I want to thank you for asking your question, because it's always important to think about like how our language includes and both disincludes and like excludes, yeah, and excludes people. And it's very valid that there are so many people who don't use literacy as their modes of expression and stuff like that. And my general point was just to be like informed and trying to inform ourselves, whether that be through literacy and understanding history, but also generally just talking to people, like talking to people who are from different backgrounds and asking them about their experiences and tying that into like the way we understand their politics and stuff like that. And a lot of cultural competency, when they don't happen in the United States, it's hard to find the literature for it, if that makes sense. And it's hard to find it because a lot of the people who are in power, who control like the discourse about like what happens to certain people, they are the ones who can like completely not like mention them, which is why we don't hear about them. But I think that like I definitely agree that like when you're talking about ways to inform yourself, it should be through literacy, but also like going through how oppressed people, the different modes in which they have been able to create to like express themselves, whether that be through dance or through like spoken word and stuff like that. And I definitely resonate with that because I know like because I'm from Harlem, New York, I know that a lot of people, students who I grew up with, they use spoken word, for example, as a mode to express themselves. And that's completely as valid and completely as valid of a story as reading about police brutality in like a book, if that makes sense. So yeah, I completely agree.
Thank you. I'm rounding up the table. I want to thank you all again for your poise, your eloquency, and your really righteous interest and passion in what you're talking about. I have a question for everybody. I'm sorry. Yasin, you did such a beautiful job talking about this relationship to global struggle through like an ummah and almost like an African diasporic lens. And I'm wondering if you see your relationship within Islam and I don't want to put like African diasporism, and I don't want to impose it if that's something you don't identify with, but if you see those things as being relationships that could help communicate these struggles to other communities, and why why your voice or a Muslim voice would be privileged in terms of like trying to understand what's happening globally, like you were talking about ahead, but there's still a challenge talking about the occupation of Palestine in the U.S., right? But you were also talking about Libya and what's happening with African folks in the slave trade. So how can you see your positionality as having, as playing a powerful role in these activist communities in addressing these global issues? So,
I'm a little confused. Do you mean like how does my identity as a Muslim
yes,
play a part?
because you were talking about how your Islam informs your activism,
Right.
like how your relationship within Islam gives you a vantage point in global struggles, right? We know mosques are segregated, we know some global issues are privileged more than others, but we do have this like global ummah sense that allows us to know that there's something happening in Burma, right?
Right.
Before anybody in the media even spoke about the Rohingya, right? So I want to know how you're managing that or expressing it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, from my understandings of your question, I think that like being Muslim allows me, like as you said, like the vantage point to like realize there's something more than myself, because I feel like when you grow up in just, mainly like I've seen it in mostly American society, like there's such this individualism to think about yourself, and if I'm fine, like I can continue on doing with that. But like being Muslim, being socialized in a Muslim community, and in a community where there were so many different types of Muslim, whether it be Muslim people from Guinea or Muslim people from Gambia, like just being surrounded by people, by different types of Muslims, and also being Muslim and learning that there are so many different Muslims like across the world, and just realizing how vast of a people like we are, I feel like it has always always just made me look beyond like myself and beyond like my struggle and try to find intersectionalities between me and other Muslim folks, because we're all like, even though like people say like Muslim people are oppressed, there's so many different ways that oppression manifests itself. So I feel like I've always just been interested in seeing like the connections between those oppressions, because even though people try to like blanket statement saying that all Muslims are oppressed, it's so different. People have such different experiences that like it's interesting to like learn about, and also just like make it known that like people do experience Islam and oppression in different ways. Yeah. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think that's really beautiful. I just want to, I'll save some of my other questions, but I want to ask Sudi what it means to be very outspoken and visible about your Islam, coming from a community that we hardly talk about in terms of how surveilled they are, the Somali community in the U.S., and especially after this election, we've already heard in the 45's rhetoric how much he's targeting Somali communities. So I wondered how you're balancing and reconciling those things.
For me, my Somali community is very dear to my heart, and I do have a lot of family in Minnesota where the Somali community is being surveilled pretty often. A bunch of young kids who are younger than me, a bunch of young men who are just like targeted to say things within their own groups, and then have one of their friends being the informant. And so he would be going out and telling them, yeah, my friends were saying all this. He would be instigating things for his friends to say things that they really don't believe. And then my Somali community in Maine, where I'm from, we tend to, I don't know, like we tend to just stick with the struggle and just keep moving on. But then when the president now, when he came to Maine, he said some things about our community and said, Maine, why are you like supporting them? Why are you behind them? They're the ones who are just bringing down your whole school system. They're the ones who are making you illiterate and making your public system just really bad. And so then he just left. And then the whole Maine community is like, what just happened? Like, And so, but then it was nice to see that the main community came up and rose with us and said we stand behind our Muslim Somali brothers and sisters, and we won't stand for this. Like, he just came, said what he had to say, disrupted our peace, and just left. And so for me, my Muslim identity is a little bit higher than my Somali identity, but that doesn't mean because my Somali identity is my Muslim identity. Because Somalia is such a majority Muslim country, when my parents left, before my parents had to fight for their image of Islam to show. When there was the independence in 1960, the presidency at the time declared that all women should dress a certain way, more westernized way, and so my mom could not express her Muslim identity. She had to hide it, and when in public. And then there was the other extreme recently. Well, Al-Shabaab was like, no, you're all going to be wearing this certain attire. When you're menstruating, you're supposed to be wearing red, so we know. And like, it's just like this whole extreme of like, and I'm controlling what they can do, both Muslim identity and their Somali identity. But for me, if I were to go back to Somalia, I would feel out of place because my American identity would show higher than my Somali identity because of my oral speech, and then they would understand immediately to surveil me. Al-Shabaab. They would be like, okay, there's an educated woman who's from America, keep an eye on her. And then in America, it's like, there's an educated Somali immigrant, keep an eye on her. And so it's like, where do I belong? Like, this sense of like, I don't belong anywhere, so let me just stick with my Muslim identity and just like cover up and just go in a corner and just read the Quran, be like, just hide out, you know? Until like all just comes and goes away. But we can't just hide out, and that's my Muslim identity come out saying, no, like there's injustice happening on both sides, and I should do something about it. The way I should do it is going to be through my Muslim identity, because that's the only one I can control at the moment.
I am Claudia Lázaro from Spanish and Portuguese. Thank you to all of you. I have a question about Smith College. You are at Smith. What is Smith doing right? What does Smith need to do? What issues do you identify as a person?
All right, let it rip.
Oh, no, you can start. I thought you look like you had something to say.
Yeah, she does.
Right. Wait, so your question is, just for people who couldn't hear, is like what Smith does right and ways it can do to improve.
Will be working on right now or in the longer term?
Should I repeat that? So in case, I don't know if everyone heard, but the question was, what could Smith do better at essentially to support like a more integrational institution and support these students better?
Are you talking about like at an administrative level, at a cultural level?
At a professorial level.
I think Smith, first of all, needs to put the money where the mouth is. Like, honestly, I don't know what else to say, but I think for a lot of us, we spoke about this earlier this year, that at times, like, a political part of our identity is accepted, but not necessarily our religiosity. We felt like sometimes like secular Muslims are more celebrated at Smith, and the religious parts of our experiences, such as praying 5 times a day, taking time off during Ramadan, or like for example, I did like research and I would say like I have to pray Taraweeh, I have to do 20 rakahs at night, and I come at 1 and I'm going to be a little late. So those parts of my identity has not been necessarily accepted, and I think this is speaking greater than just simply Smith. It speaks about like the intellectual secular culture of institutions across this country and in the West. Yeah, so if that could be culturally, academically, intellectually, could be changed. It's not a one-day work. I think it's going to take decades. That would mean a lot probably to us.
And I think the 2 cents that I would like to add to this, I'm not going to talk in generalization. I'm going to talk about very pragmatic things that I've seen and I want to have changed. I'm a writer for The Sufine. I'm one of the editors. I write in the opinion section, and I covered, I think twice, the issue of halal dining at Smith. Now, I recognize and I understand my privilege. I go to a school where halal dining is offered, and I think that in itself I think is a great thing, because I know friends from back home who've come to, study in the US, and they have to resort to being a vegetarian because even if they go to eat chicken, or if they, sort of suppress their religious beliefs and they say, I'm going to eat the chicken, there will be some form of contamination happening in the kitchen, where there's pork being cooked with chicken, all of that stuff. So I wrote a piece about how I think halal dining at Smith should be improved last year, and I saw that there was an improvement this year, and Katarzi Dining Hall was completely made halal dining. But I still think that there is room for improvement, because I see that there is a difference in the way that kosher dining is treated and the way that halal dining is treated. And I feel like it is absolutely, I don't understand why there is a difference, and nobody can verbalize it exactly, but I feel like everybody over here on this panel recognizes that there is a difference in the way that kosher dining is treated at Smith, the quality of food they get, the way that it's treated, the way it's served, and the way that halal dining is served at Smith right next door to kosher in the same dining hall. I feel like there is a lack of respect given to that food. They recently went through changes in this Campus Center Cafe, where they reduced food options, they made it more expensive, and they took away the only meat that you can eat. Like, there's a fish sandwich in there, they took that away, so there is absolutely nothing in the CC Cafe that you can, as a Muslim, eat if you practice eating halal. I think that's absolutely ridiculous, and I think there should be something to eat for us. I don't know. It's something that I'm trying to bring it more attention to at Smith, so that it can be changed, because I don't think it's a huge thing to ask for us to be able to eat without having to think too hard about it.
And also, I think that there's a lot of things that Smith does right in terms of being able, I feel like we are in a privileged place where we are able to have, actually said, options to halal food, and able to have a prayer hall that's closer to campus. And the staff in religious life have been very, very receptive to listen to us, and always wanting to be to get feedback from us on things that can improve. So I don't think there's a problem of listening at Smith to things that we want to change. Sometimes you have to push for it, but that's everything. I think that sometimes, going back to the idea that I was talking about in my paper, in my speech that I just gave, is people don't actually take what it means to be Muslim. They're okay with the physical identity and having being Muslim as a statistic, but when it comes to actually how does that change what it means for me to be a student at Smith, there's a huge disconnect there. And for example, with this whole conference, I was very shocked to when I found out that there wasn't halal food being served, because I'm we have halal food and it's an option. So the fact that it wasn't being served was very wow, I feel like it just should have been an option. And then sometimes all you want to hear is I'm an apology, I'm sorry, I understand, in the future we can do this, but people aren't culturally competent now, and they try to gloss over it, because instead of as she was saying, instead of having halal options, which is an option, we resort to vegetarian food, or when the only beverages are alcoholic ones and water. It's just what audience are you serving? And I think there just needs to be more of a cultural competency and understanding, and actually caring about what it means to be Muslim, and how that might affect the way I live my life, or the way that I go about spaces at Smith. So I think that that's just not even, it's not necessarily something specific that needs to be changed, like a specific type of physical thing that needs to be changed, but a change in the way that we think about diversity, and making it more actually caring about what it means to have diversity, and if that means that you have to make accommodations for people, being willing to do that as well. So that's what I think.
Yeah, I would also, on the topic of diversity, I would say there's changes that need to be made not only at an administrative level, but also at a cultural and social level. So just thinking about within, I think on campus there have either numerous instances of Islamophobia that have happened, whether when people are going into town, in classrooms, on Smith Confessional. if you don't know what Smith Confessional is, it's like it's a website you would never want to go onto. And I think also there are problems at Smith even within the Muslim communities. So obviously I've talked a lot about homosexuality and queer issues. I can say I've witnessed and I've heard many stories of people making homophobic comments, even within like the Muslim community on campus. And so I think that's also work that needs to be done, and I think those are things that need to be changed within communities, and really I think creating space and recognizing diversity is really important, and I don't know that there is not really space for queer Muslims on this campus, and I think that's definitely something that needs to be addressed.
I agree with what everyone said, and I just want to add that there's one thing for me I encountered is just the lack of accountability and the lack of taking responsibility for the wrongdoings or the mistakes people have made, including in administration. And there's always the runaround, it's not my fault, it's this department, it's not my fault, it's this department, go talk with that person, go over there, and it's just like, where did I start, where do I go, who's taking accountability for their actions? Everyone's just taking the scapegoat and blaming others. And so I just want people to just take ownership of what's wrong with the institution, and now we can move on to how do we fix it.
And if I can just add one thing, I think this is very indicative of kind of the dynamic. We ask Muslim students to study hard and apply yourself and then come and speak, but at the same time, if there was a need for this to be expressed even in this kind of a setting, then it really just shows the need for this to be expressed. So I want to say thank you to all of you, and I also want to say thank you for asking that question, because if we find the space and time, change will hopefully, more voices will be heard, and we have documentation. So.
Can I go?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So my question is kind of inspired from what Sudid, is that how you pronounce it? Mm-hmm. Sudid was talking about how her
Somalian identity is really tied to her Muslim identity, because for me, my racial identity is as a half North African, half white person is really tied to my Muslim identity. So my question is, do you feel like your racial identity, how do you feel like your racial identity is tied with your Muslim identity? And I also want to acknowledge that this is a lot of emotional labor for all of you to be on this panel. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say thank you for sharing your personal stories and your private stories.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll start off by when I came onto campus, it was I don't know, my Muslim identity was more of a comfort zone, and I would just lean on that as my my prominent identity, because I didn't want to face the fact that my African identity is different than Black identity here on campus, because there was the BSA, and I just didn't feel included, or I just didn't want to take that chance to make myself included, and so I just immediately went to the MSA and disregarded my African identity and just went straight to my Muslim identity as my comfort level. And I know I should have tried harder to push myself into the uncomfortable part of society here. And so that's just a whole different topic of what it means to be African versus what it means to be African American. And yeah, it's just now my Somali identity is tied to my Muslim identity, because I grew up in a Muslim household with my Somali parents always giving me the option. I would always ask, hey mom, what would you do if I just took off the hijab? Because and I had it since I was a little girl, and that's all I remembered. And she just do what you like, just remember, it's up to you. It's between you and God. And then I'm just okay, I don't want to take it off because that's all I know. It's I feel weird taking it off. Instead, what would be the other option? If my parents raised me without the hijab and said, when I turned of age, okay, do you want to wear it? Then it would be I don't feel comfortable putting it on. So it's for me, I feel thankful for them for just letting me choose later, but still giving me the option of growing up wearing it instead of giving me the option of growing up not wearing it and then choosing. Because I know personally I would be I don't want to wear it because it's my comfort level, and I always stick with what's comfortable for me.
Wait, can I add something quickly
Yeah.
to that? Because it's actually very interesting that you asked that question, because I remember in the beginning of the year, like, I had this whole breakdown session where I, like, it was like I literally, like, cried because I was just, like, not in Harlem anymore, surrounded by my Black Muslim community, and I didn't think it would have an effect on me, 'cause I'm like, well, there are Muslims everywhere. So but it was really hard for me just because I felt like being Muslim, there are certain types of Muslims that are more acceptable than other types, and you could see that based off of the type of halal food even that's served, or you could see that based off of the type of language that it's used, whether it's an assumption that everyone in the room speaks Arabic. Like, you come into a space where a lot of people have this, like, box of what it means to be Muslim and how you have to dress if you're Muslim. And I feel like sometimes it felt like I had to choose between my Black identity and my Muslim identity, and that even though, like, when I grew up all my life, like, they were both connected because I knew so many Black Muslims, but then coming here, it was like a little separate, where I felt like I had, like, my Black friends and I had my Muslim friends, which is very unfortunate because, like, I should be able, that is my identity, and I should be able to interconnect the two, but that has not been the case for me so far. But it's more, I think it's just, I also want to try to, like, make it more known as opposed to just being like, okay with those two being separate. Because, for example, in yesterday's performance, there were so many references to things that a lot of Black people could, like, relate to because they grew up in, there are a lot of people in at Smith who grew up in New York and who are familiar with that culture. And I'm like, but you look around the room and there weren't as many, like, Muslim Black people, and I was just like, wow, that's really unfortunate because so many people could have been down, like, related to, like, what was being said in the performances. So that was just one connection I had to, like, even yesterday's performance.
Okay, we have, thank you. We have time for about one more question, I would say. Yes. You have the mic.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. You young people are so fabulous. It gives me hope for the future. And I just wanted to speak for a minute about LGBT Muslims. I, in the 70s and 80s, identified as pretty much a lesbian separatist. And then I fell in love with a Muslim brother and became Muslim. And I found that it was just the same. All the women are together, all the men are together. It really was so comfortable for me. And I so love my faith. And even though now I've been with a woman partner for 5 years, I do want to say Surah 4, Ayat 15 does talk a little bit referencing two women together and calling it lewd, and that you should lock them in their house, something like this. I'm verbatim, not verbatim. Lock them in their house, and then if they repent, you can let them out. So it does address it, even though it's sort of remote. But there are tons of LGBT Muslims, which if you go online, you can find. We've had retreats and tons of things. So I look at, coming from Christianity, back in the day, they were killing gay people too. So I do feel that we're way behind Christianity in terms of acceptance. But inshallah, it will come. And I think the young people are the ones that will lead the way on that. So thank you.
I don't know that I would say that we are behind Christianity in that respect. I think, especially in the West, I think the way that we look at Christianity and the way that we look at Islam are very different. And I think also when we approach Muslim communities, there's almost expectation that Muslims must follow all of like the legal pronouncements, or must be very by the book. And I think we don't have that same expectation of Christianity. So I think there's a lot of recognition that, like, people don't ask, what is Christianity? I think it's not as much of a common question to ask, what does Christianity say about homosexuality? I think that's a much more prominent question, especially now, about Islam. And I think a lot of this idea that, like, we are behind Christianity in that respect, I think comes in part from that. Because there's this idea that, like, in Christianity, a lot of Christian communities have accepted gay Christian members as being Christian and being valid. And so I think that kind of thinking causes us to think that maybe, like, Muslims have not accepted gay Muslims. And in some communities that is true, but I also think it's really important to reevaluate the assumption that Muslim communities must necessarily be homophobic. I definitely think there is homophobia in Muslim communities, but also, what do we assume when we first meet a Muslim, and why do we assume that? I know personally, like, for a long time, I think I've associated strong conservatism or strong religiosity with meaning that someone would be more closed-minded to LGBTQ rights, but a lot of Muslims are very religious and very, I think they're not mutually exclusive, and so I think that's something that we should definitely think about. And I think people are actually doing really great work, and even if it's not as talked about, I think that's definitely, yeah, something that has been done, and like I was saying, has been addressed since even like the 8th century is some of what I was reading. So definitely not, yeah, it's just what I would say, definitely not behind so much.
Yeah. And if I could just add to that one more thing, I think it's really difficult to compare religions and faiths. Like, how can you do that looking at the history of the world, looking at the way Christianity has in itself influenced Muslim communities through colonialism and things like that? I do not think it's fair to put the two on the same, they've not had the same trajectory, especially if we're looking at queer Muslims in an American context. It's like a huge, huge difference. And I think like a lot more research needs to be done. And yeah, I just think like, what Inas said.
Yeah, actually when you were talking, I was just thinking Muslim majority countries. I actually was talking to one of my friends before, and we were talking about how a lot of the laws which like condemn homosexuality in Muslim majority countries have come as a product of colonialism. And I think what the 4 Muslim majority countries that don't ban homosexuality or don't have any condemnation or any laws against homosexuality are ones that were not colonized by the British. So I think that's also very important to know the history. Yeah.
History. I think with that, we are out of time and we can conclude this wonderful session.